The first few weeks were peaceful. Mike enjoyed the silence after years of apartment living in Los Angeles. He'd sit on his back porch with a beer, watching the sunset paint the distant hills orange and red. But then the feeling started, that prickly sensation of being watched. It began subtly. Mike would catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision while working in the yard. But when he turned to look, nothing was there. He attributed it to wildlife, coyotes, maybe, or desert foxes. The rational part of his mind provided easy explanations for every strange occurrence. The footprints appeared after the first rain. Mike discovered them circling his house, bare human footprints pressed deep into the mud. They formed a perfect circle around his property, as if someone had walked the perimeter repeatedly throughout the night. The prints were small, maybe a woman's size 7, but the stride was unnaturally long, as if whoever made them had been walking on their toes. Mike called the Kern County Sheriff's Department. Deputy Williams came out that afternoon. A weathered man with kind eyes who'd seen everything rural California had to offer. He examined the prints with professional interest but couldn't offer much help. Could be a vagrant, Williams suggested, photographing the clearest prints with his phone. We've had issues with homeless folks camping on private property. I'll increase patrols in this area. But Mike knew it wasn't a vagrant. Vagrants didn't walk perfect circles around houses. They didn't leave prints that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, though Mike convinced himself that was just his imagination playing tricks. The watching intensified. Mike began closing his curtains at dusk, but he could feel eyes pressing against the windows like physical weight. His dog, Rex, a normally fearless German Shepherd mix, refused to go outside after sunset. The animal would whimper and scratch at the back door during the day, eager for his evening walk. But come nightfall, he'd cower in the corner, hackles raised, staring at the windows with terrified eyes. Sleep became elusive. Mike would lie in bed, listening to soft footsteps circling his house, always just quiet enough to doubt. The steps had a rhythm. 7 steps clockwise, pause. 7 steps counterclockwise, pause, repeat. Hour after hour, night after night, the pattern never varied. He set up a security camera system. 4 high-definition cameras with night vision covering every approach to his house. The next morning, Mike eagerly reviewed the footage, certain he'd finally have proof of his midnight visitor. But the videos showed only empty yard, swaying grass, and the occasional rabbit or coyote passing through the frame. Yet he could clearly hear the footsteps on the audio track, soft but unmistakable, following that same 7-step pattern. Mike's sister Jennifer visited from Sacramento and immediately sensed something wrong. She found Mike hollow-eyed and jumpy, startling at every shadow. When she asked about the footsteps she'd heard circling the house the previous night, Mike's relief at having a witness was overwhelming. "You heard them too?" he asked desperately. Jennifer nodded, her face pale. It sounded like someone was walking around and around the house all night. "Didn't you see anything on your cameras?" They reviewed the footage together. Again, the cameras showed nothing, but the audio picked up the steady rhythm of bare feet on dirt and gravel. Jennifer suggested Mike stay with her for a while, but he refused to be driven from his home by something he couldn't even see. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later. Mike had fallen asleep on his couch while watching late-night television. He woke to find his front door standing wide open, cold desert air flowing into his living room. Rex was nowhere to be seen. Heart pounding, Mike grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside to call for his dog. The footprints were everywhere, not just the usual circle around the house, but meandering trails leading to each window, the front door, even up onto his porch. In the beam of his flashlight, Mike could see that some prints were still wet, as if made by feet dripping with morning dew. He found Rex cowering behind his truck, unharmed but trembling violently. As Mike coaxed the dog back toward the house, he heard something that made his blood freeze, a soft humming coming from inside his home. The melody was unfamiliar, almost childlike, drifting out through his open front door. Mike called 911. By the time deputies arrived, the humming had stopped, but they found muddy footprints throughout Mike's house. Small bare feet had walked through every room, leaving a trail from the front door to each window, as if someone had been checking the view from every angle. Deputy Williams took a full report, but Mike could see the skepticism in his eyes. The evidence was undeniable. Someone had been in the house, but the lack of any signs of forced entry or stolen property made it difficult to classify as a crime. The final incident happened on a moonless Thursday night. Mike woke to find his bedroom door, which he'd locked before bed, standing open. At the foot of his bed stood a figure, pale, impossibly thin, with long, dark hair covering most of its face. In the darkness, Mike couldn't tell if it was male or female, adult or child. It stood perfectly still, arms hanging at its sides, head tilted at an unnatural angle as if listening to something only it could hear. Mike reached for his bedside lamp, but when the light clicked on, the figure was gone. The bedroom door remained open, and wet footprints led from where the figure had stood, out of the room and down the hallway. Mike followed the trail with his pistol drawn, but it simply ended at his front door, which stood open to the night. Mike packed his belongings that morning and moved back to Los Angeles. He sold the house to a property investment company at a significant loss, never mentioning his experiences to the buyers. The realtor later told him the house had been on and off the market for years. Previous owners rarely stayed more than a few months. Sometimes, in his downtown apartment, Mike still wakes to the sound of soft footsteps circling his building. He tells himself it's just city noise, late-night pedestrians, delivery workers, urban life continuing its endless cycle. But deep down, he knows the truth. Some things, once they find you, never really let you go. The Bakersfield house still stands empty, though neighbors report seeing lights moving through the rooms on moonless nights, and the same small footprints still appear in the dirt after every rain. This is not a test. A catastrophic event has occurred in downtown San Francisco. Residents are advised to remain indoors and avoid all windows. Do not attempt to look outside. This message will repeat. Cooper immediately checked her computer for any alerts from the National Weather Service or emergency management, but found nothing. She tried calling the station manager, but the phones weren't working. Even her cell phone showed no signal, which was impossible in downtown San Francisco. The emergency message played on loop for 17 minutes before cutting to dead air. Cooper attempted to override the system and return to regular broadcasting, but her equipment wouldn't respond. Every button she pressed, every switch she flipped, resulted in nothing but static or silence. Looking out the station's windows, Cooper saw that downtown San Francisco appeared completely normal. Street lights illuminated empty sidewalks. Traffic lights cycled through their colors for non-existent traffic, and the distant Bay Bridge glowed with its usual string of lights. Everything looked exactly as it should at 3 in the morning. But something felt wrong. The air itself seemed heavier, pressing against the studio windows like a physical presence. Cooper noticed that none of the digital clocks in the station were advancing. They all showed 3:17 a.m., frozen at the exact moment the emergency broadcast had begun. She tried the emergency phone, a direct line to the station's parent company, but it only produced a busy signal. Her computer showed no internet connection despite the Ethernet cable being properly connected. She was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a radio station that had somehow become isolated from reality. At 4 a.m., according to her watch, since all the station clocks remained frozen, Cooper heard footsteps in the hallway outside the studio. This was impossible. The building was locked, and she was the only person scheduled to be there. The footsteps were measured and deliberate, moving slowly down the corridor toward her booth. Cooper locked the studio door and killed all the lights except for the dim red recording light. Through the soundproof glass window that looked out into the hallway, she saw a figure in an old-fashioned suit walking past. The man appeared to be from another era. His clothes looked like something from the 1942, and his hair was slicked back in a style that went out of fashion decades ago. The figure paused directly in front of her studio window and turned to look at her. His face was raw, features blurred as if seen through water, and his eyes were completely black. When he smiled, his mouth stretched too wide, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to go on forever. Cooper backed away from the window, but the man raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. Where his palm touched, frost began to spread in intricate patterns. The temperature in the studio dropped dramatically, and Cooper's breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. The man mouthed something at her, but Cooper couldn't hear through the soundproof glass. He repeated it several times, becoming more agitated when she didn't respond. Finally, he pulled out what looked like an old microphone and spoke into it. His voice came through the studio's speakers, impossibly clear despite the lack of any connection. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "This broadcast was never meant for you." Cooper found her voice. "Who are you? What broadcast?" The man tilted his head at an unnatural angle. "The emergency alert. It was meant for the others, not the living. You've intercepted something that wasn't yours to hear." Through the studio's other window, the one that looked out onto the city, Cooper saw that downtown San Francisco was no longer empty. The streets were filled with people, but they all wore clothing from different eras. Some in Victorian dress, others in 1920s attire, still others in styles she couldn't identify. They all walked with the same measured pace, all heading in the same direction toward the bay. "They're going home now," the man explained, following her gaze. "The emergency broadcast called them back. It happens every few decades when the veil grows thin, but you weren't supposed to hear it. You weren't supposed to see them." The parade of anachronistic figures continued outside, hundreds of people from different time periods all walking together in perfect silence. Cooper noticed that none of them cast shadows despite the bright street lights, and their feet made no sound on the pavement. "What are you?" Cooper whispered. "I'm the broadcaster," the man replied. "I've been sending the message for longer than your city has existed. Every time the dead need to return to where they belong, I call them home. But you've seen something you shouldn't have. You've become part of the broadcast." Cooper felt a strange compulsion to leave the studio and join the procession outside. The urge was overwhelming, like a physical force pulling her toward the door. She fought against it. gripping the edge of her broadcast desk until her knuckles turned white. "Fight it if you want," the broadcaster said with that horrible stretch smile. "But you've heard the emergency alert. You're part of the system now. The message will play in your head until you answer the call." The emergency broadcast began playing again, but this time it was coming from inside Cooper's own mind. The words echoed in her skull, growing louder and more insistent with each repetition. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it made no difference. The sound was coming from within. As the sun began to rise over San Francisco, the procession of displaced souls grew thinner. The last few stragglers hurried past the radio station window, their forms becoming more translucent as daylight strengthened. The broadcaster remained at Cooper's window, his hand still pressed against the glass, frost spreading in ever more complex patterns. "Your shift is almost over," he said, "but you'll be back. The next time the veil thins, the next time we need to send the emergency broadcast, you'll be here to help, whether you want to or not." Cooper's watch finally began moving again as full daylight flooded the studio. The clocks on her equipment flickered back to life, all showing 6 a.m. exactly. Her computer reconnected to the internet, her phones began working, and the radio station's regular morning programming automatically resumed. The broadcaster was gone, but his handprint remained frozen on the studio window, a perfect impression surrounded by intricate frost patterns that wouldn't melt despite the warming morning air. Cooper tried to tell her manager about the incident, but her words came out wrong. Every time she attempted to describe what had happened, she found herself talking about equipment malfunctions and power outages instead. It was as if something was preventing her from revealing the truth. The emergency broadcast never appeared on any official logs. According to every record, KQED had maintained normal programming throughout the night. But Cooper knew what she had experienced, and she dreaded the next time she'd be assigned the overnight shift. 3 months later, Cooper was working another late night shift when the emergency alert system activated itself at exactly 3:17 a.m. This time, she didn't fight the compulsion when she heard the broadcaster's voice calling her name from the hallway. The next morning, Cooper's replacement found the studio empty, with no sign of where she had gone. The only clue was the handprint on the window, now accompanied by a second print, smaller and more delicate, frozen in perpetual frost that no amount of heat could melt. Jessica arrived at the hospital just before sunset, her camera equipment loaded with high ISO film perfect for low-light photography. The security fence had several gaps worn by previous visitors, and she slipped through without difficulty. The main building loomed against the darkening sky, its windows broken and walls covered in decades of graffiti. Her professor had specifically mentioned the hospital's unique architecture, a sprawling Art Deco complex that had once been considered a model for progressive mental health treatment. Now it stood as a monument to abandonment, its ornate facades crumbling and its interior reclaimed by vandals and nature. Jessica began shooting as soon as she entered the main corridor. The late afternoon light streaming through broken windows created dramatic shadows and highlighted the decay in beautiful, haunting ways. Her camera captured peeling paint that looked like abstract art in doorways that framed nothing but darkness. The first indication that something was wrong came when Jessica reached the hospital's central courtyard. According to her research, this area should have been empty, except for overgrown vegetation and debris. Instead, she found it meticulously maintained, grass neatly trimmed, flower beds carefully tended, and benches that looked like they'd been recently painted. Through her camera lens, however, the courtyard appeared completely different. The viewfinder showed the abandoned ruin she'd expected, weeds growing through cracked concrete, rusted playground equipment, and scattered medical files yellowed with age. Jessica lowered her camera and saw the maintained garden again. When she looked through the lens, decay and abandonment returned. Confused but intrigued, Jessica began photographing everything she could see. This was exactly the kind of unusual documentation that would make her thesis project stand out. She shot roll after roll of film, capturing the strange dual nature of the hospital, beautiful and maintained to the naked eye, but ruined and forgotten through her camera. As darkness fell, Jessica moved deeper into the hospital complex. Her flash illuminated rooms that showed the same bizarre duality. Empty corridors appeared clean and freshly painted without the camera, but her photographs would later show them filled with overturned gurneys, scattered medical equipment, and walls covered in disturbing patient artwork. In what had once been the children's ward, Jessica found toys scattered on the floor. Not the moldy, broken playthings she expected, but toys that looked new, as if children had been playing with them moments before her arrival. When she photographed them, her flash revealed something entirely different. Restraints attached to small beds, padded walls stained with substances she didn't want to identify, and scratches in the paint that formed desperate messages. The photographs Jessica took that night revealed a hospital that had never truly closed. Her camera captured images of patients in hospital gowns wandering the halls, doctors in white coats making their rounds, and nurses pushing medication carts down corridors that appeared empty to Jessica's unassisted vision. One photograph, taken in the former surgery suite, showed an operation in progress. A patient lay on the table while masked figures worked around them under bright surgical lights. Jessica had taken the picture of what appeared to be an empty room with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls, but her developed film told a different story entirely. The most disturbing images came from the hospital's basement morgue. Jessica had found the area using architectural plans from the city planning office, descending through a service stairwell that her flashlight revealed to be clean and well maintained. But her photographs showed the same stairwell crumbling and flooded, with warning signs about structural damage. In the morgue itself, Jessica's eyes saw empty metal tables and vacant drawers and walls of refrigeration units that no longer worked. But her photographs revealed the morgue in full operation. Bodies covered by sheets on every table, and forms moving between them that looked like medical examiners going about their work. One photograph, taken almost accidentally when Jessica stumbled in the dark, captured something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her flash had illuminated what she thought was an empty corner, but the developed image showed a group of figures in hospital gowns and medical coats, all staring directly at the camera. Their faces were wrong, features blurred as if the film had been double exposed, but Jessica knew she'd only taken one shot. Jessica left the hospital just after midnight, her camera loaded with several rolls of exposed film. The drive back to USC took her through the desert on Highway 14, and she spent the journey trying to rationalize what she'd experienced. Light tricks, she told herself, old film stock. Some kind of chemical reaction between her flash and residual substances in the abandoned building. But when she developed the film in the university's dark room, Jessica discovered that her photographs told a complete story. The story of a hospital that had never actually closed, where patients from different eras continued to receive treatment from doctors who had been dead for decades. The most chilling discovery came when Jessica enlarged one of the photographs from the children's ward. In the background, barely visible behind what appeared to be ghostly medical equipment, was a figure in modern clothes holding a camera. It was Jessica herself, but the image showed her with that same blurred, wrong look that afflicted all the other figures in her photographs. Jessica tried to research the history of Hawthorne Mental Hospital, hoping to find some explanation for what her camera had captured. She discovered that the facility had been closed abruptly following a series of patient deaths that were never fully investigated. Several staff members had reported strange incidents in the months before the closure. Patients appearing in areas they couldn't have accessed, medical equipment operating on its own, and night shift workers hearing sounds of normal hospital activity coming from wings that had already been evacuated. The most disturbing discovery was a newspaper article from the hospital's final week of operation. A night security guard had reported seeing photographers and urban explorers inside the building, taking pictures of ongoing medical procedures. Hospital administrators insisted the building was empty except for security staff, but the guard's description of the photographers matched Jessica perfectly, down to the specific camera equipment she'd been using. Jessica realized that her night at the hospital hadn't been a one-time paranormal experience. She had somehow photographed herself participating in events that occurred decades ago, or maybe she had become part of the hospital's ongoing existence outside normal time. The final photograph on her last roll of film confirmed her worst fears. It showed the hospital's main entrance at dawn, with the figure walking away toward a parked car. The figure was clearly Jessica, but the timestamp on the photograph showed it had been taken 30 years earlier, decades before Jessica was even born. Jessica never returned to Hawthorne Mental Hospital, and she changed her thesis project to focus on urban architecture rather than abandoned buildings. But the photographs she took that night continued to develop new details over time. Images that appeared normal when first printed now show additional figures, new messages scratched into walls, and faces in windows that weren't there before. Sometimes Jessica receives emails from other photographers who have visited the hospital. They always include the same type of photographs, images that show the hospital in operation, with staff and patients going about their daily routines in a facility that was officially closed decades ago. And in the background of many of these photographs, barely visible but unmistakably present, is a young woman with a camera who looks exactly like Jessica Wright.